Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the crowded officers' club, watching the promotion celebration unfold before her. The room buzzed with excitement as newly promoted officers received congratulations from their peers. She held her drink quietly, observing rather than participating in the festivities. Sarah had been invited to the party like everyone else in her unit, but she felt like an outsider. At 28 years old, she was one of the few female officers in her division, and despite her impressive record, some of her male colleagues seemed to view her as nothing more than a diversity hire. The promotion party was being held at the base's finest venue, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over polished floors. Officers in their dress uniforms mingled throughout the spacious hall, their medals catching the light as they moved. The atmosphere should have been celebratory, but Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching her every move. She had earned her place here through years of hard work and dedication. Her military record spoke for itself: top scores in training, successful missions overseas, and commendations for leadership under pressure. Yet somehow, she still felt like she had to prove herself over and over again. "Look who decided to show up," came a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see Lieutenant Jake Morrison approaching with two other cadets, their faces wearing smug expressions that made her stomach tighten. Jake was known for his arrogance and his belief that women had no place in combat roles. He had made Sarah's life difficult from the moment she joined the unit, questioning her decisions and undermining her authority whenever possible. Tonight, with alcohol flowing freely, his usual restraint seemed to have disappeared completely. "I'm surprised you got an invitation, Martinez," Jake continued, loud enough for nearby officers to hear. "This party is for people who actually earned their promotions through merit, not through special treatment." Sarah felt her jaw clench, but she maintained her composure. She had learned early in her career that reacting emotionally only gave people like Jake more ammunition to use against her. Instead, she took a sip of her drink and looked him directly in the eye. "I earned my place here the same way everyone else did, Morrison," she replied calmly. "Through hard work and dedication to serving my country." The two cadets flanking Jake, Peterson and Williams, exchanged glances and snickered. Peterson stepped forward, emboldened by Jake's lead. "Come on, Martinez. Everyone knows how the system works these days. The military needs to fill quotas, and having a pretty face like yours around makes for good publicity," Peterson said with a nasty grin. Sarah could feel anger building in her chest, but years of training had taught her to channel that energy productively. She straightened her shoulders and fixed Peterson with a steady gaze that had intimidated far more experienced soldiers than him. "If you have concerns about promotion procedures, I suggest you take them up with your commanding officer," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Until then, I'd recommend focusing on your own performance instead of questioning mine." But Jake wasn't finished. He had been drinking heavily, and the presence of his friends gave him a false sense of confidence. He moved closer to Sarah, invading her personal space in a way that made several nearby officers turn to watch the confrontation. "You know what I think, Martinez? I think you're in way over your head. This isn't some college sorority where you can smile your way through problems. This is the real military, where lives depend on making the right decisions under pressure. And frankly, I don't think you have what it takes." The conversation around them began to die down as more people noticed the tension. Sarah was aware that this moment would define how many of her colleagues viewed her going forward. She could back down and try to defuse the situation, or she could stand her ground and risk escalating the confrontation. Williams, not wanting to be left out, decided to add his own insult. "Maybe you should stick to desk jobs, Martinez. Leave the real soldiering to the men who can handle it." Sarah set her drink down on a nearby table with deliberate care. When she looked up, her expression was completely calm, but there was steel in her voice that made even Jake take a small step backward. "Gentlemen, I've served in 3 combat deployments and led successful missions that saved the lives of soldiers under my command. I've earned every commendation and promotion through demonstrated competence and leadership. If you'd like to question my qualifications further, I'd be happy to discuss my record with your superior officers present." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was drawing a line that Jake and his friends would cross at their own peril. But alcohol and masculine pride made them oblivious to the warning. Jake's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He had expected Sarah to back down or become emotional, giving him the reaction he wanted. Instead, she had turned the tables and made him look foolish in front of a growing audience. "Listen here, Martinez," Jake said, his voice rising dangerously. "I don't care what your little participation trophy record says. When push comes to shove, you'll fold under pressure like every other woman who thinks she can play soldier. You don't belong here, and everyone knows it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The surrounding officers had stopped their conversations entirely now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Sarah could see various expressions on their faces, some supportive, others uncomfortable, and a few that seemed to agree with Jake's assessment. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would be crucial. She had 2 choices. She could escalate this confrontation and potentially damage her reputation, or she could find a way to shut down Jake's harassment without compromising her dignity. "Morrison, I understand that change can be difficult to accept," she said, her voice carrying across the now quiet room. "But the military I serve values merit, courage, and dedication to duty above all else. Those qualities aren't determined by gender, and I've proven I possess them in abundance." Jake sneered at her response. "Pretty words, Martinez, but talk is cheap. When bullets start flying, we'll see how tough you really are." Peterson and Williams nodded in agreement, clearly enjoying the show. They had no idea that their behavior was being observed by more than just their immediate audience. Several senior officers had noticed the commotion and were watching with growing disapproval. Sarah remained perfectly composed despite the increasing hostility. She had faced enemy fire and life-or-death situations that would have broken lesser soldiers. 3 drunk cadets trying to humiliate her at a party barely registered as a threat compared to what she had already survived. "I've already proven myself under fire, Morrison. Multiple times, in fact. But I understand if you need to diminish my accomplishments to feel better about your own insecurities." The subtle insult hit its mark. Jake's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was clearly struggling to maintain his composure, and Sarah could see that she had successfully turned the tables on him. But Jake wasn't ready to give up. In his alcohol-clouded mind, backing down now would mean admitting defeat in front of his peers. Instead of walking away, he decided to double down on his harassment. "You think you're so smart, don't you, Martinez? Well, let me tell you something. Nobody here respects you. They just tolerate you because they have to. You're a diversity hire, plain and simple. And everyone knows it except you." The accusation stung because Sarah had heard variations of it throughout her career. No matter how well she performed or how many challenges she overcame, there would always be people ready to attribute her success to anything except her own merit. But instead of defending herself again, Sarah decided to try a different approach. She looked around the room at the faces watching the confrontation, many of whom she had served alongside in various capacities. "I think you'll find that my colleagues, who have actually served with me in the field, have a different opinion," she said calmly. "They've seen my leadership under pressure and know exactly what I'm capable of accomplishing." Several officers in the crowd nodded slightly, confirming her statement. These were men and women who had witnessed Sarah's competence firsthand and respected her abilities regardless of her gender. Jake noticed the supportive reactions and realized his position was weakening. Desperate to regain control of the situation, He decided to make one final devastating attack on Sarah's credibility. "Well, we'll see how long your supporters stick around when the real pressure starts," Jake said with a malicious grin. "Because mark my words, Martinez, you're going to fail spectacularly, and when you do, everyone will see that I was right all along." The threat was clear, and Sarah realized that Jake wasn't just expressing his opinion anymore. He was actively working to undermine her career and reputation. The realization that she had a real enemy within her own unit was sobering, but it also strengthened her resolve. "I appreciate your concern for my career, Morrison," Sarah replied with mock sincerity. "But I think you'll find that I'm more resilient than you imagine. In fact, I look forward to proving just how wrong you are about my capabilities." The exchange had reached a stalemate, with neither side willing to back down completely. The tension in the room was palpable, and several senior officers were clearly preparing to intervene if the situation escalated further. But before anyone could act, the sound of a microphone being tested echoed through the room. The base commander, Captain Richard Hayes, had stepped up to the podium at the front of the hall. His presence commanded immediate attention, and the crowd began to quiet down and turn toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," Captain Hayes announced, his authoritative voice cutting through the remaining chatter. "I have some important announcements to make regarding recent promotions and assignments." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as the focus shifted away from her confrontation with Jake. She was grateful for the interruption, but she also knew that this public humiliation had damaged her reputation among some of her colleagues. As Captain Hayes began speaking about various administrative matters, Sarah noticed that Jake and his friends had moved away from her, apparently satisfied that they had made their point. But the smug expressions on their faces told her that they believed they had won this round. What none of them knew was that Sarah Martinez carried a secret that would soon change everything. Her true identity and the real reason for her presence at this base were known only to the highest levels of command. The promotion party that was supposed to celebrate the achievements of junior officers was about to become something entirely different. Captain Hayes continued his remarks, discussing the importance of leadership and dedication in military service. Sarah listened with growing anticipation, knowing that her moment of vindication was approaching. The men who had tried to humiliate her were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Captain Hayes continued his speech from the podium, but Sarah noticed his eyes scanning the room until they found her. There was something different in his expression, a mixture of respect and anticipation that seemed out of place for a routine promotion ceremony. "Tonight, we celebrate not just promotions but the values that make our military strong," Captain Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent room. "Merit, courage, and dedication to duty above personal comfort or convenience." Jake Morrison stood with his friends near the bar, still wearing a satisfied smirk from his earlier confrontation with Sarah. He had no idea that his behavior had been observed and noted by several senior officers, including Captain Hayes himself. "However," Captain Hayes continued, his tone becoming more serious, "I've been made aware that some individuals in this room tonight have forgotten these fundamental values. Some have chosen to judge their fellow officers based on prejudice rather than performance." An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt dozens of eyes turning toward her, and she realized that word of the confrontation had spread quickly through the room. She maintained her composure, but inwardly she wondered if Captain Hayes was about to make the situation worse by drawing more attention to it. Jake's smirk faltered slightly. He glanced around nervously, suddenly wondering if his loud confrontation with Sarah had been noticed by more people than he intended. Peterson and Williams shifted uncomfortably beside him, their earlier bravado beginning to fade. "Military service requires trust," Captain Hayes said, his gaze now fixed directly on Jake's group. Trust that your fellow officers will perform their duties with competence and dedication, regardless of their background or personal characteristics that have nothing to do with their ability to serve. Sarah found herself holding her breath. She had experienced public humiliation before, but never in such a formal setting with so many of her colleagues watching. She wondered if Captain Hayes was about to reprimand Jake publicly, which might help her reputation, but could also make her seem like she needed protection from superior officers. Tonight, I want to address some misconceptions that apparently exist within our ranks, Captain Hayes continued. There seems to be confusion about how promotions and assignments are determined in this military. Let me be absolutely clear. They are based solely on merit, performance, and the needs of our service. Jake's face was beginning to show signs of real concern now. He had been drinking heavily, but the captain's words were sobering him up quickly. He started to realize that his public attack on Sarah might have consequences he hadn't considered. I've had the privilege of serving with many outstanding officers throughout my career, Captain Hayes said, his voice growing stronger. Some of the best leaders I've known have been women, minorities, and individuals who others might have initially underestimated based on superficial characteristics. The room remained completely silent except for the captain's voice. Sarah could feel the tension building as everyone waited to see where this speech was heading. She noticed several officers nodding in agreement with the captain's words, while others looked uncomfortable with the direct challenge to their prejudices. But tonight, I have a very special announcement to make, Captain Hayes said, pausing for effect. We have been honored by the presence of a distinguished officer who has been conducting a routine inspection of our facilities and personnel. Sarah's heart began to race. She had been dreading this moment for weeks, knowing that her cover would eventually be blown. She had hoped to complete her inspection quietly and leave without drawing attention to her real identity. Jake and his friends looked confused by this turn in the captain's speech. They had no idea what this announcement had to do with their earlier confrontation with Sarah, and they were beginning to hope that the captain had moved on to other matters. This officer has been observing our unit for the past several weeks, evaluating our readiness, leadership capabilities, and adherence to military values, Captain Hayes continued. Her assessment will be crucial in determining our unit's future assignments and resources. The use of the pronoun her sent a shockwave through the room. There were very few high-ranking female officers who would have the authority to conduct such an inspection, and most of the junior officers present had never encountered one in person. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, knowing that the moment she had been dreading was finally here. She had enjoyed the anonymity of being just another lieutenant, even though it had subjected her to harassment and discrimination. Once her real identity was revealed, everything would change. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Hayes said, his voice rising with obvious pride and satisfaction, I would like you to meet General Sarah Martinez, who has been serving among us as Lieutenant Martinez during her inspection of our unit. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Every face in the room turned toward her with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to horror, depending on how they had treated her during her time at the base. Jake Morrison's face went completely white. The drink in his hand began to shake as the full implications of Captain Hayes's announcement sank in. He had just spent the evening publicly humiliating a 4-star general, questioning her qualifications, and suggesting she didn't belong in the military. Peterson and Williams looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. They had participated in the harassment of one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire military, and they were beginning to realize that their careers might be over before they had really begun. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing that she could no longer maintain her cover. The inspection had been completed anyway, and Jake's behavior tonight had forced the situation to a head. She walked toward the podium with the confident bearing that befitted her actual rank. Thank you, Captain Hayes, Sarah said as she approached the microphone. Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding thousands of soldiers. It has been educational to serve among you these past weeks. The transformation was remarkable. The quiet, composed lieutenant who had endured harassment and discrimination was suddenly revealed as one of the most powerful officers in the military. Her posture, her voice, even her facial expression conveyed the confidence and authority of someone who regularly made decisions affecting national security. I want to thank those officers who treated me with professionalism and respect during my time here, Sarah continued, her eyes scanning the crowd. Your conduct reflects the best values of our military and gives me confidence in this unit's capabilities. Several officers in the crowd stood a little straighter, knowing they had passed an important test without even realizing they were being evaluated. They had treated Sarah fairly based on her apparent rank and demonstrated competence, not knowing they were being observed by someone with the power to make or break careers. However, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious, I have also observed behavior that falls far short of the standards we expect from military officers. Discrimination, harassment, and prejudice have no place in our ranks, and officers who engage in such conduct damage the effectiveness and morale of their entire unit. Jake felt like he might be sick. Every word he had said to Sarah tonight was now playing back in his memory, but with the knowledge that he had been speaking to a 4-star general. He had questioned her qualifications, suggested she was a diversity hire, and claimed she didn't belong in the military. I've seen officers who judge their colleagues based on gender, race, or other irrelevant characteristics rather than evaluating their actual performance and capabilities, Sarah continued. This kind of thinking is not only morally wrong, but it also weakens our military by preventing us from utilizing the full talents of all our personnel. The room remained silent, but Sarah could see various reactions playing out across the faces before her. Some officers looked ashamed, realizing that their own prejudices had been exposed. Others appeared angry, either at themselves for being fooled or at Sarah for what they saw as deception. During my time here, I was subjected to harassment and discrimination that would be unacceptable regardless of my rank, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. But what made it particularly troubling was the assumption that I didn't belong here, that I hadn't earned my position through merit and hard work. Jake wanted to run from the room, but his legs felt frozen. He was acutely aware that everyone in the room knew exactly who Sarah was referring to, and that his behavior had been witnessed by dozens of his colleagues. Let me be clear about something, Sarah continued, looking directly at Jake's group. I have spent over 20 years in military service. I have commanded troops in combat, led successful operations in hostile territory, and made life-and-death decisions that have saved the lives of countless soldiers. Her voice carried the weight of experience and authority that came from years of leadership at the highest levels. Jake realized that every qualification he had questioned, every achievement he had dismissed, was probably just a small fraction of Sarah's actual accomplishments. I have earned every promotion through demonstrated competence and leadership, Sarah said. My gender had nothing to do with my advancement, and any officer who believes otherwise is demonstrating their own ignorance about how military promotions actually work. The rebuke was devastating in its precision and professionalism. Sarah hadn't raised her voice or used emotional language, but her words cut through Jake's arguments like a sword. Everyone in the room could see that she was exactly the kind of leader the military needed, regardless of her gender. I want to address the young officers who participated in tonight's harassment directly, Sarah said, her gaze settling on Jake, Peterson, and Williams. Your behavior tonight has shown me that you are not ready for positions of leadership or responsibility. The 3 men felt like they were shrinking under her stare. They had gone from feeling powerful and in control to being publicly dressed down by one of the most senior officers in the military. Leadership requires the ability to evaluate people fairly, to recognize talent regardless of its packaging, and to treat all personnel with dignity and respect, Sarah continued. You have demonstrated that you lack these fundamental qualities. Jake finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. General Martinez, I didn't know. That's exactly the problem, Lieutenant Morrison, Sarah interrupted, using his actual rank with pointed emphasis. You made assumptions about my qualifications and my right to be here without knowing anything about my background or experience. That kind of prejudiced thinking has no place in a professional military. The use of his name sent another shock through Jake. Sarah had been listening to and remembering every insult, every dismissive comment, every suggestion that she didn't belong. She had maintained perfect composure while being attacked by subordinate officers who had no idea they were committing career suicide. Your comment that I would fold under pressure like every other woman who thinks she can play soldier was particularly enlightening, Sarah said, her voice carrying a hint of steel. It showed me that you view military service as some kind of game, rather than the serious responsibility it actually is. Peterson and Williams were trying to make themselves invisible, but Sarah's attention turned to them as well. And your suggestion that I should stick to desk jobs shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what leadership actually requires, Sarah said to Williams. Some of the most important decisions in military operations are made from behind desks by officers with the experience and judgment to coordinate complex operations. The systematic dismantling of their arguments was methodical and complete. Sarah was demonstrating exactly why she had risen to such a high rank, using their own words against them with surgical precision. But perhaps most disturbing was your assumption that my presence here was about filling quotas or creating good publicity, Sarah said, looking back at Peterson. That kind of thinking reduces accomplished officers to nothing more than their demographic characteristics. And it's exactly the kind of prejudice that weakens our military. The room remained completely silent as Sarah delivered her assessment. Every officer present was witnessing a master class in professional leadership and dignity under pressure. Even those who might have harbored similar prejudices were forced to recognize the competence and authority Sarah displayed. The weight of Sarah's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Jake Morrison felt sweat beating on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Every eye in the room was on him and his friends, and he could practically feel his military career crumbling around him. Now, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a more administrative tone, let me share some of the observations from my inspection that are relevant to tonight's events. Captain Hayes remained at attention beside the podium, his expression showing both respect for Sarah's authority and satisfaction that the harassment he had witnessed was finally being addressed by someone with the power to do something about it. During my weeks here, I observed numerous examples of excellent leadership, professionalism, and dedication to duty, Sarah said, scanning the crowd. I also observed troubling patterns of discrimination and harassment that suggest serious problems with unit culture and leadership development. Several senior officers in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their own leadership was being evaluated based on how they had allowed their subordinates to behave. Lieutenant Morrison, Sarah said, focusing her attention directly on Jake, your behavior tonight was not an isolated incident. I've observed you undermining female colleagues, questioning orders from superiors you deemed unworthy of respect, and generally conducting yourself in a manner unbecoming of a military officer. Jake felt his knees go weak. Not only had Sarah been watching his confrontation with her tonight, but she had been observing his behavior for weeks without his knowledge. Every casual insult, every dismissive comment, every act of insubordination had been noted by someone with the authority to end his career. Your assumption that women in the military are diversity hires shows a fundamental misunderstanding of military standards and promotion procedures, Sarah continued. It also demonstrates the kind of closed-minded thinking that prevents the military from effectively utilizing all its human resources. Peterson and Williams stood frozen beside Jake, wondering if they would be called out individually as well. They had followed Jake's lead in harassing Sarah, but now they were beginning to realize that loyalty to a friend was no protection against the consequences of their actions. "Lieutenant Peterson," Sarah said, turning her attention to Jake's accomplice, "your comment about leaving real soldiering to men shows that you have a very limited understanding of what modern military service actually requires." Peterson felt his face burning with shame and embarrassment. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he had just been following Jake's lead, but he realized that nothing he could say would undo the damage he had done. Military operations today require intelligence, adaptability, cultural sensitivity, and technological expertise in addition to physical strength, Sarah continued. Officers who can't recognize and utilize the diverse talents of their personnel are fundamentally unsuited for leadership positions. The lecture was devastating in its precision. Sarah was systematically destroying every argument the three men had made while demonstrating exactly why she had risen to such a high rank in the military. "Lieutenant Williams," Sarah said, completing the trio, "your suggestion that I stick to desk jobs reveals another common misconception about military leadership. The most critical decisions in modern warfare are often made by officers analyzing intelligence, coordinating logistics, and managing complex operations." Williams felt like he might faint. He had never been dressed down by such a high-ranking officer, and the public nature of the humiliation made it even worse. He could see his hopes for career advancement disappearing with every word Sarah spoke. "All three of you have shown me that you are not ready for positions of increased responsibility," Sarah said, her voice carrying the finality of a judicial sentence. "You lack the judgment, professionalism, and leadership potential that the military requires from its officers." The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing career-ending moments for the three young officers who had chosen to harass a four-star general. "However," Sarah continued, and Jake felt a tiny flicker of hope at the word, "I believe in the military's ability to develop better officers through proper training and mentorship." Captain Hayes stepped forward slightly, understanding that Sarah was about to announce the consequences of the evening's events. "Lieutenant Morrison, you will be transferred immediately to a training program focused on leadership development and equal opportunity policies," Sarah announced. "You will spend the next 6 months learning about the military's commitment to diversity and inclusion, and you will not be eligible for promotion during that period." Jake felt a mixture of relief and dread. Transfer was better than dismissal, but his career advancement had just been set back by months or possibly years. He would also have to explain to future commanders why he had been sent for additional training. "Lieutenants Peterson and Williams, you will join Lieutenant Morrison in this program," Sarah continued. "Additionally, all three of you will receive formal letters of reprimand that will remain in your personnel files." The formal reprimands were serious business. They would follow the three officers for the rest of their careers, making future promotions much more difficult and limiting their opportunities for choice assignments. "Captain Hayes," Sarah said, turning to address the base commander directly, "I'm recommending that this unit implement mandatory training on military values and equal opportunity policies for all personnel. Tonight's events have shown me that there are cultural problems here that need to be addressed." Captain Hayes nodded grimly. He knew that mandatory training programs would reflect poorly on his leadership, but he also understood that failing to address the problems Sarah had identified would be much worse. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "I'm recommending the establishment of a mentorship program pairing junior officers with senior personnel who can model appropriate professional behavior and military values. The additional programs would require resources and time, but Captain Hayes knew better than to object to recommendations from a four-star general who had just witnessed serious misconduct in his unit. Now," Sarah said, her tone shifting slightly as she addressed the broader audience. I want to speak to all the officers present about what we can learn from tonight's events. The crowd remained at attention, knowing that they were about to receive guidance from one of the highest-ranking officers in the military. Military service is built on the principle that we are stronger together than we are individually, Sarah began. When we allow prejudice and discrimination to divide us, we weaken our entire organization and compromise our mission effectiveness. Several officers nodded in agreement, recognizing the truth of her words from their own experiences in diverse military units. Every officer in this room, regardless of their background, earned their commission through the same rigorous standards, Sarah continued. When you question someone's qualifications based on their gender, race, or other irrelevant characteristics, you're essentially arguing that our military standards don't work. The logic was unassailable. If the military's promotion and assignment procedures were fair and effective, then anyone who had advanced through the ranks must have demonstrated the necessary competence and leadership potential. I've served alongside outstanding officers of every background imaginable, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. Some of the bravest soldiers I've known were women. Some of the most brilliant strategic thinkers I've encountered were minorities. Leadership excellence comes in many different packages. Jake and his friends stood at the back of the crowd, still processing the magnitude of their mistake. They had attacked not just a superior officer, but someone whose career achievements far exceeded anything they were likely to accomplish. The military I serve values merit above all else, Sarah continued. But merit includes the ability to work effectively with people from different backgrounds, to recognize talent regardless of its source, and to maintain professionalism even under pressure. She looked directly at Jake's group as she emphasized the last point, making it clear that their behavior tonight had shown they lacked these essential leadership qualities. Tonight, some officers in this room failed to meet these standards, Sarah said. But I've also seen examples of the professionalism and integrity that make our military strong. Officers who treated me with respect based on my apparent rank and demonstrated competence, not because they knew my real identity. Several officers in the crowd stood a little straighter, knowing they had passed an important test they didn't even know they were taking. Going forward, I expect every officer in this unit to remember tonight's lessons, Sarah said, her voice taking on the commanding tone that had directed major military operations. Treat your colleagues with dignity and respect. Evaluate people based on their performance and potential, not their demographics. And remember that military service is about something bigger than your personal prejudices. The message was clear and direct. Sarah was setting new standards for the unit's culture, and everyone present understood that these standards would be enforced. Captain Hayes will be implementing the changes I've recommended, and I'll be monitoring this unit's progress, Sarah continued. I expect to see significant improvement in both performance and culture when I return for follow-up inspections. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Sarah would be watching to see if the lessons of tonight were actually learned and implemented. In closing, Sarah said, her voice softening slightly, I want to thank those officers who showed me that this unit has the potential for excellence. Your professionalism and dedication give me confidence that the changes we're implementing will be successful. She stepped back from the microphone, and Captain Hayes immediately stepped forward to conclude the evening. Thank you, General Martinez, for your insights and recommendations, Captain Hayes said. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's events have given us much to think about. I expect every officer in this unit to reflect on what we've learned and to demonstrate the highest standards of military professionalism going forward. As the formal portion of the evening concluded, the crowd began to disperse slowly. Many officers approached Sarah to introduce themselves properly and express their respect for her service. Others avoided eye contact, embarrassed by their own previous assumptions or behavior. Jake, Peterson and Williams found themselves standing alone as other officers moved away from them. They had become pariahs in a matter of minutes, their reputations destroyed by their own poor judgment and prejudice. "What do we do now?" Peterson asked quietly, his voice barely audible. Jake stared at the floor, still trying to process what had happened. "We learned from this," he said finally. "We accept the consequences and try to become better officers." It was perhaps the first mature thing Jake had said all evening, but it came far too late to undo the damage to their careers and reputations. Sarah finished speaking with the officers who had approached her and made her way toward the exit. As she passed Jake's group, she paused for a moment. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, "you have the opportunity to learn from this experience and become better leaders. I hope you'll take advantage of it." With that, she walked away, leaving the three young officers to contemplate the wreckage of their assumptions and the long road ahead to rebuild their careers. The promotion party that had begun as a celebration had become a powerful lesson about respect, prejudice, and the true meaning of military leadership. For some officers, it would be a night they would remember as a positive turning point in their careers. For others, it would serve as a permanent reminder of the consequences of letting prejudice override professionalism. As the evening ended and officers began to leave, the story of Lieutenant Martinez's real identity and the confrontation with the three cadets began to spread throughout the base. It would become a legendary tale told and retold to future officers as an example of why military service demands the highest standards of professional conduct and respect for all personnel, regardless of their background or apparent rank. The night that Jake Morrison had intended to humiliate a fellow officer had instead become a defining moment that would reshape the culture of the entire unit and serve as a lasting testament to the importance of judging people by their character and competence rather than their demographics.